Då tänkte jag att vi tar och kör igång. We will start with this lunch seminar. My name is Holm, member of the Parliament, a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, but I also have the pleasure to be in the board of the Jarl Hjalmarson Foundation, and today have the pleasure to moderate this lunch seminar. Because I see some, for me at least, some new faces, some old faces, and you are all warmly welcome. And we're very happy that you come here. The Hjalmarson Foundation is a foundation founded in the beginning of the 90s, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, and is working with party-affiliated democracy support with our basic values, freedom, democracy, and market economy. Working mainly with sister party support in many parts of the world, from South Caucasus, Eastern Europe, Balkans, Africa, but also a substantial lot of work in South and Latin America. And that's why we are very happy to have John Suarez here today, that I will come back to very, very shortly. In the background here, you see a website which will be introduced later today and found on the Hjalmarson Foundation website, hjalmarsonfoundation.se, where it will be continuously updates about the ongoing situation and development in Cuba. But to give more information about the situation in Cuba and the region, we are very happy to have the International Secretary for the Cuban Democratic Directorate, and a well-known human rights defender, John Suarez, here, and I'll let you introduce yourself a little bit more, so the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you. And welcome.
Thank you for having me. As he was saying, my name is John Suarez. I'm the International Secretary of the Cuban Democratic Directorate. We're a nonprofit organization started by students originally in 1990, seeking to promote human rights inside of the island and provide assistance to the nonviolent opposition, humanitarian and otherwise. And we've also done a lot of work in the human rights field with the first the UN Human Rights Commission and later with the UN Human Rights Council, and at the OAS with the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. Yesterday was an important day for me personally because it was the 10-year anniversary of the Black Cuban Spring that also happened to be the year that I first went to the UN Human Rights Commission and dealt with this massive crackdown in which 75 human rights defenders were sentenced anywhere from up to 28 years in prison, and initially were being threatened with death sentences. At the same time, the 3 Cuban hijackers who were trying to flee to the United States were arrested, sentenced in a show trial to death, and executed within the space of 1 week. So we had that happening at the same time that they were threatening to also apply the death penalty to people who were organizing a petition drive called the Varela Project to call for human rights reforms in the Cuban legal system. The other item that I wanted to touch on, and looking here at this page, the first 2 stories are very relevant. The second one, Castro's official violence against women, comes to mind because yesterday on March 18th, in Palma Soriano in the east of Cuba, in the province of Santiago, the ladies in white were meeting and having a literary tea when they were attacked by a mob organized by Cuban state security and political police at the home of Lady in White Denia Fernandez Rey. And through tweets that were being sent until early this morning, Jose Daniel Ferrer Garcia, one of the activists who back in 2003 was being threatened with the death sentence for his activism, was tweeting as to what was happening to these women. One of the spokespersons of the Ladies in White was also present at the home, Belkis Cantillo. And this took place over a number of hours, beginning at 4:41 in the afternoon, and the last tweet we received was around 8:43 p.m., describing how communist brigades were beating and arresting 6 women for merely expressing outrage at what they were witnessing taking place against the Ladies in White. And some of these women were so badly beaten that they had to be hospitalized. State security then pressured the doctors to release them even though they weren't fully recovered. And as I said, this just happened yesterday. And it's part of a pattern that has been increasing over the last 4 years. With Raul Castro's arrival on the scene in Cuba, rather than things improving, they've gotten worse. And I'd like to show you some of the images of the women that have been impacted. This is this lady here who has the stitches that you can see on top of her head. Marina Montes Piñon is a lady in white who was badly beaten with a blunt object in December of 2012. On the eve of International Women's Day, March 7th of this year, 2013, Iris Tamaras Perez Aguilera was repeatedly assaulted and attacked again, hitting her in the head. She'd been attacked before in prior years to the point that she's actually developed a cyst that has not been attended to by medical doctors. I think you can, let me see if I can hit this to increase the size, as you can see here. And she suffers from very serious headaches. It seems to be some sort of fluid there from the constant hits to the head. And this is another angle of it. This was, again, March 7th, March 8th. She was trying to get medical treatment, but Cuban state security was impeding and blocking it. So women are being attacked. There's also the case of Berenice, let's see if I can find the picture, a 15-year-old girl who was protesting someone bad-mouthing the ladies in white, and she was stabbed repeatedly with a razor blade and disfigured. And this was in November of 2012. So this is things that are happening right now. And why is it happening? For a number of years, beginning in 2003, things actually, for the opposition's best moment was in 2002. That's when they got 11,020 signatures for the Varela project. They delivered it to the National Assembly. Osvaldo Payá, Regis Iglesias, Tony Diaz-Sanchez of the Christian Liberation Movement went there, turned it in. Jimmy Carter went a short time later to Cuba at the University of Havana. He made reference to the Varela project, and millions of Cubans became aware of a citizen initiative for democratic change in the island. The regime's response, a major crackdown, not allowing the petition drive to be accepted as it should have been under Cuban law to be debated before the National Assembly. Instead, they blocked that. They set up their own petition drive to declare the Cuban Constitution untouchable, which that passed very quickly. And then they had this March 18th crackdown in which the chief architects of this petition drive were arrested and sentenced to an excess of 28 years in prison. They thought at that moment that they had crushed the opposition. But what happened was the wives, mothers, and sisters who previously had not been opposition activists mobilized, and they founded the Ladies in White. And heading the Ladies in White was a very capable woman by the name of Lara Poyan. She also had other leaders within the movement, people like Berta Soler, who's currently the spokesperson. And they began to organize weekly marches, demonstrations, lobbying diplomats, trying to spread beyond Havana into other provinces, and forcing the regime to address the issue of these prisoners of conscience. And these 75 were all recognized by Amnesty International as prisoners of conscience. That was taking place inside of Cuba. Outside of Cuba, a couple of very good friends of the Cuban freedom cause set up an international committee for democracy in Cuba. It was first proposed early in 2003, a couple of months after the crackdown by Václav Havel. And pretty soon you had a committee of former heads of state, people like Václav Havel, José María Aznar, the Prime Minister of Spain, Mart Laar of Estonia was part of this committee, and they set up a permanent committee to focus in on obtaining the release of these political prisoners and promoting democracy and human rights in Cuba. And they were having events in different parts of the world for a number of years. So what happened? They succeeded. The 75, thanks to this pressure from the women and opposition activists inside, the diplomats outside, the heads of state, members of parliament, signing petitions, pressuring the Cuban government. By 2010, coinciding with the death of one of the activists, Orlando Zapata Tamayo, who died in a hunger strike when he was being denied water for approximately 18 days, these activists, again, generated another round of demonstrations inside the island, greater outrage internationally, and put enough pressure on the dictatorship that they felt obligated to release these prisoners. Now, rather than sitting down with the ladies in white, who had been the primary force inside of the island to obtain this release, they decided to work with an institution that was already recognized as independent, which was the Catholic Church. So instead of the Catholic Church serving as a mediator between the opposition and the government, the regime basically accepted the Catholic Church as the opposition representative to sit down and negotiate the terms of release for these prisoners, and then left the cardinal the unenviable task of calling the families of the political prisoners and the political prisoners themselves and asking them if they would go into exile or not, even though it wasn't clear that they had to be released, but it wasn't clear that they would be released if they didn't go to Spain. This process ended by March of 2011, and then we saw a decrease in international attention towards Cuba because the prisoners were out. Raul Castro was trying to generate the image of some type of cosmetic changes, which in reality were not true changes. And Osvaldo Payar Sardinas described it as fraudulent change. But the international community was no longer as focused in Cuba. So what we saw happening after the death of Orlando Zapata Tamayo and the release of these prisoners, other opposition activists dying under suspicious circumstances. Juan Wilfredo Soto Garcia in May of 2011, beaten by state security agents at a park, who died 3 days later of a pancreatitis, most likely product of the attack. Wilman Villar Mendoza, another prisoner, Amnesty International prisoner of conscience, who died on hunger strike in January of 2012. And then we saw, since there wasn't a reaction to those deaths, we saw an escalation with Lara Poyan Toledo. After her husband was released, and the ladies in white said they would continue their work to see that all of Cuba's political prisoners were released, and that they were now a human rights movement. Within the space of weeks, she became ill and died. And she died within the space of 7 days. Now, you must recall that these women, while they were marching and protesting, were also being injected with needles, that nobody really knows what were in those needles. Secondly, once she got to the hospital, Oscar Elias Becerra, a dissident doctor, described what she was subjected to as purposeful medical neglect. So that was October 14th of 2011. Again, Wilman Villar Mendoza dies in January of 2012, and there's not a big reaction from the international community about this. The opposition, people inside of Cuba, are outraged. They're marching, they're protesting, they're suffering greater escalations of violence against these activists. And then the Pope visit. Pope Benedict XVI arrives in Cuba, and the regime succeeds in shutting down all the cell phones of the opposition and rounding up many of the opposition activists. One of them, Sonia Jarl, today was, I think it's her 1-year anniversary in prison along with her husband, Lady in White, who had been beaten beforehand as well by state security. Then we see July 22nd, Osvaldo Payar Sardinas, who just a few weeks prior, they had tried to throw a car against he and his wife in Havana, and his vehicle was knocked over on its side, and if not, by the grace of God, he could have been killed then, but he and his wife. And a couple weeks later, on July 22nd, traveling from Havana to Bayamo with Aaron Modig from Sweden and with Angel Cajumero from Spain, they were being followed, and this we know because there were tweets from the government, the pro-regime Twitterers saying that Payá was on the road in the morning, and then later from the testimony of Angel Cajumero, who appeared in an interview in the Washington Post and spoke with Rosa Maria Payá, that they were being followed by different vehicles, beginning in Havana all the way to Bayamo, when finally there was a red Lada that crashed into their car, forcing them off the road. And then you have this Spanish citizen, Swedish citizen, held in custody under the tender mercies of the Cuban intelligence service, an intelligence service that was trained and formed by the East German Stasi. And there's been some sort of bilateral agreement between the Spanish government and the Cuban government in terms of getting Angel Cajumero out, where the Spanish government has recognized the show trial that was performed against Mr. Cajumero, and he's still serving out his sentence in Spain. The Payá family views this as an outrage, and they're demanding an international investigation. into what actually happened. And this past week, I was in Geneva with Rosa Maria Paya when she spoke before the UN Human Rights Council, in which the Cuban regime accused her of being a mercenary and tried to censor her presentation, along with China, Pakistan, Belarus, and other gross human rights violators who came to the defense of the dictatorship in Cuba. And I want to play for you a moment her presentation, and also you can see the interventions by these various countries.
Gracias, señor presidente. Thank you, Mr. President. My name is Rosa Maria Paya of the Crystal Library and daughter of the National Coordinator Osvaldo Paya, opposition leader and recipient of the Sakharov Prize of the European Parliament. My father dedicated his life to working for legal peaceful change so that Cubans can enjoy all their rights. He promoted the Umbrella Project, which was a request for a referendum supported by more than 25,000 citizens who had defied repression to call for changes in the laws guaranteeing freedom of expression, association, free elections, freedom for peaceful political prisoners, and the possibility for having private companies in the country. To date, the government refuses to declare this genocide and has jailed most of its leaders. Yosvani Malcor Rodriguez is 30 years old and has spent 3 years in prison as a punishment because his mother is a member of our movement. The Cuban authorities said that my father and Jarl, a young activist, died in a traffic accident, but after interviews were held with us, we have confirmed that the murders were not accidental. Point of order, says the President.
Punto de orden, la delegación de Cuba.
There's a point of order from the delegation of Cuba. Thank you, Mr. President. I apologize for the noise in the room, but it was necessary to interrupt the event by the mercenary who has dared to come to this room. We would like to ask Mr. President if this debate on item 4 is aimed at referring to general questions which may show a pattern of violations of human rights, or whether it is also to be used to address specific issues, such as what is just being done now by the mercenary who has been taking the floor at this juncture. We have this concern, Mr. President, and we would be very grateful if you could clarify things for us, and if you could show to this to the mercenary who would state it. Thank you.
Mr. President, we respectfully ask that you rule that the speaker be allowed to finish his or her presentation. Thank you.
The Chinese delegation believes that the concern of the Cuban delegation valid.
Our delegation would like to put what has been said by the delegation of Cuba, objecting to the procedure being used for conducting the meeting.
Support the point of order raised by the Cuban delegation. Thank you.
The delegation is asking for the floor to support the request put forward by Cuba. Thank you very much. Mr. President, the delegation of other groups joins with the well-founded statement on the point of order and procedural issues as raised by the delegation of Cuba. Thank you. I would like to remind the organizations that are speaking that we are on agenda item 4, the human rights situation which require attention in the Council, and that they confine to that subject matter in their statements.
Gracias, señor Presidente.
President, the driver of the car stated to the Washington Post that they were deliberately rammed into from behind. The text messages, the state security services of the Cuban government are calling my family's house in Havana to say we're going to kill you. The same death threats were extended to my father. It's the responsibility of the Cuban government to ensure the physical integrity of members of my family. Today we are making an appeal signed by 46 political leaders and activists from the entire world. We call upon the United Nations to start an independent investigation into the death of my father. Truth is essential in the process of reconciliation that the democratic transition in Cuba so requires. We do not seek vengeance. It is our right to know who is responsible for the death of my father. When will there be a response to the demand stands for the human rights of the people of Cuba in enjoying democracy and basic freedom. Thank you, Mr. President.
President, an anti-Cuban mercenary addressed Council today to try to blame the Cuban government for the death of her father, who died last year in a car accident. This mercenary was accredited by United Nations Watch, a reactionary NGO without any credibility. Nobody takes it seriously, and it only works for the service of the United States. Rosa Maria Paya is a created, invented individual, financed and promoted by the US government. She has close relations with the US Interest Office in Havana, which she has visited on many occasions. As regards the alleged facts, nobody in their right mind would believe them. During the oral and public hearing, and on the basis of abundant proof, including expert proof, it was shown that Anker Carabero was driving at well above 120 kilometers an hour, and it was his lack of attention and care, the fact that he was driving too fast, and a wrong decision to step on the brakes too hard on a slippery surface that caused this tragic accident, which cost the life of two individuals. But Anker Carabero in fact recognized this. Both Rosa Maria Paya and Regis Iglesias, speaking on behalf of another phony NGO, are vulgar agents paid by the US government, paid and educated and trained by the US government in order to bring about a regime change in Cuba. They both work for those who are in favour of the blockade and aggression against their own people.
An interesting side note. Osvaldo Paya, when the U.S. Began to send al-Qaeda prisoners to Guantanamo Naval Base, the Castro regime initially was offering to offer assistance if any of those prisoners escaped to return them to the base. The first person who criticized sending those prisoners to Guantanamo was Osvaldo Paya Sardinas, who said that even if they were terrorists, they were still human beings and had certain fundamental human rights, and that it was unacceptable to be sending them to Cuban territory. So he was definitely someone who was an independent thinker with an independent voice, and the same can be said of the movement that is still left after his passing. I also want to talk about one of the things that was brought up here, and I'll conclude and then we can go to questions and answers, is that about these changes that they've been discussing. The reality is that they announce things and then they don't follow through. In 2009, the first time that Cuba underwent its Universal Periodic Review, in the days leading up to it, the foreign minister, Pérez Roque, and then the minister of justice both announced that the special rapporteur on torture would be granted an invitation to Cuba. They repeated it 2 or 3 times, were very public about it, but never followed through. The special rapporteur at the time, Manfred Nowak, held a press conference about 1.5 years later at the Human Rights Council and was extremely critical about the lack of follow-through because the promises that were being made led him to concentrate on Cuba rather than make other visits that he could have done at that same period of time. Secondly, international media talked about how right now there's a lot of talk about the issue of travel, that a new law was passed and that there's reform. The problem is, what's happened is they've replaced one set of controls with another. Beforehand, you had to have your passport, and then you had to request a white card to obtain permission to be able to leave the island. And that white card would be, you'd be subject to all sorts of restrictions based on political content, based on what profession you practice. Now, they've gotten rid of the white card, but those same restrictions are present for obtaining the passport. And Rosa Maria Paya has spoken on more than one occasion how in December of this past year, she had all the items necessary to be able to travel outside of Cuba, but the officials told her, you can't travel and we'll let you know when you're allowed to travel. Earlier this year, in February, she just went to the airport, tried to get on the plane to see what would happen, and she was able to get out this time. Will they allow her to return? Will they allow her to travel again outside the next time? There are no guarantees, because these reforms are not based on rights. They're not really reforms. They're basically cosmetic to try to sell an image internationally, to try to increase the legitimacy of the regime. Another example of this was that there was news late last year. The BBC News reported that Cuba's ban on anti-Castro musicians, people like Celia Cruz, was being quietly lifted, and others soon followed in reporting the news. The story specifically mentioned Celia Cruz as one of the artists whose music would return to Cuban radio. Yet, on August 21st, less than 3 weeks later, Tony Pinelli, a well-known musician and radio producer in Cuba, distributed an email which Rolando Alvarez, the national director of the Cuban Institute of Radio and Television, confirmed that the music of the late Celia Cruz would continue to be banned. The email clearly stated, quote, "All those who had allied with the enemy, who acted against our families like Celia Cruz, who went to sing at the Guantanamo base, the ICRT arrogated to itself the right, quite properly, not to disseminate them on Cuban radio." Was this reported widely in the news? No. The initial announcement that was very positive but not factually true, you can find everywhere. This later announcement, you can only find a reference in Diario de Cuba. And that's the problem. They're getting away with generating this false, fraudulent image of reform, while at the same time, the human rights situation is deteriorating and people are dying and people's lives are being threatened like Rosa Maria Payas. So I thank you for your time and I welcome your questions.